All right. So why does AI pedagogy matter for you? Before we move into the first section, I want to pause on this because this is where the benefits become very concrete. Everything on this slide is about what changes for you as a teacher when assignments and assessments are designed to be practically AI aware. If AI aware design didn't make teaching easier, more practical, or more sustainable, it wouldn't be worth doing. So let's walk through what actually changes. First, let's start with the fact that teachers will feel immediately that AI aware assignments tend to be structurally explicit by necessity. AI aware assignments spell out the stages, the decision points, the constraints, and often require reflections that serve as both evidence of learning and a way to evaluate. And because these tasks are things that AI cannot complete too well and that are necessary for student learning in this environment. And as a result, the idea is that you're going to get fewer emails asking you for clarification, fewer partial submissions that miss the point, and fewer rounds of telling students, no, that's not what I meant. In other words, making assignment AI aware naturally encourages really spelling out what good submission looks like and what expectations are explicit up front. So you'll spend less time correcting mistakes after the fact. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat. This is one of the most immediate time saving. So the second point, though, is about decision making. AI-aware assessments are intentionally designed so that the evidence of understanding is visible to the teacher. So you can see how a student is thinking. This will allow you to give feedback faster, identify misconceptions earlier, and make instructional and pacing decisions with more confidence. So that reduces then the amount of time ensuring that students understand or have the skills that they need, which consumes a ton of your teacher energy. The third point is that unclear AI rules create constant low stress for teachers, that having suspicions and second guessing and inconsistent enforcement, which makes us uncomfortable in conversations that are where we've already got a submission turned in and now we're negotiating. So AI-aware tasks reduce that load by separating the generation of the assignment from the judgment of the assignment and the use of AI. I don't care anymore if a student uses AI. Instead, I care if they can explain, justify, revise, or apply what I'm teaching. And it's a much more stable and humane position for me to teach from. And the last point ties everything together, which is that when tasks require drafts, rationale, revision, and decisions or contextual judgment, the teachers no longer fear like they must infer authorship from a finished product. It allows you to spend your time on things that you want to, like instruction and feedback and supporting thinking. This is one of the core goals of AI-aware pedagogy, and it shifts your role back from enforcing AI policies to education. And AI-aware design might add work up front. It will add work up front in the early stage, but it will replace a lot of that long-term, repetitive, and invisible work later that is necessary for structure in today's AI learning environments. Okay, so let's quickly go on to section 1 here, where we are going to talk about how to reconnect with first the information that we learned in the Girls Go STEM course and look honestly at where AI is showing up in our teaching, because we can't adjust the practice until we understand where we're really working in. So 3 main takeaways that I really had from the Girls Go STEM Meaningful AI Pedagogy course was first, that the definitions that we have of AI literacy and AI aware teaching, those terms get used a lot, but unless we anchor them clearly, we really don't have a shared meaning for them. They mean different things to different people. So one thing I enjoyed was that it provided a shared baseline for understanding these terms that get used a lot. First, we learned that AI literacy is not about learning how to use AI tools efficiently. It's about instead helping students ask better questions, verify their claims, and accept rather than just like accepting the output, and recognize the limitations of AI systems. It's important because AI will produce the most fluent, confident responses, even when it is dead wrong. So literacy means here judgment. If students can question outputs, check evidence, and explain why something might be unreliable, then AI becomes a learning support. And the second point that I found from the course is that AI pedagogy doesn't assume AI automatically reduces learning. Instead, we are asking, how can AI prompt deeper thinking? So in this framing, AI doesn't replace thinking. It would trigger thinking. And that's a design principle that we'll kind of keep coming back to throughout this webinar. And finally, we ground all of this into 5 ethical principles: fairness, transparency, accountability, privacy, and security, which can help us decide what to allow in the classroom, what to restrict, and what responsibilities are going to remain with our students. One second here. Sorry, computer issues. All right, so with that having been said, let's move on. So in this slide, it's pretty intentionally simple because I want to go over what is already happening in the classroom, whether we're planning for it or not, without framing it as good or bad. I think ultimately, I don't want to judge students for using AI, and just be aware of how they use it so we can anticipate how we are going to teach. So let's start with one of the most common AI uses, which is that students will use it to generate possible research questions, like give me 3 possible research questions about renewable energy storage. Ask them for help around making something clearer or better organized. Maybe they want examples of real world applications, or they're asking you to rephrase a paragraph, especially if it's something in a second language. None of those uses are particularly surprising because they mirror things that students already do with their peers, textbooks, tutors, and online resources. The key difference here is the speed and availability. So when we see this kind of AI use, we already know the answer to why is the student doing this? It becomes our responsibility then to ask, what assumptions does this change about how I design a learning task? We will come back to that a little bit later. The second quick category I want to highlight is because we often assume students are using AI to generate answers. That's where our minds immediately go. But students also use AI to generate questions. So for example, what questions can I ask to understand this topic better? Generate practice questions from these slides, and then I can use them as a study guide. Or I think that this causes this, but is that correct? That's kind of use often is unknown or unseen by teachers, but it's interesting because it's a good use case for AI to help identify gaps in their understanding and test their own mental models. But whether that deepens the learning or depends very much on how we design tasks and assessments. And that's why awareness matters simply more than just prohibiting AI. And finally, AI is not just a chatbot, it's embedded in the tools that students are already using. Tools like Grammarly, data analysis software, even graphic design tools have AI enhancements now. And in many professional and industry contexts, these tools are expected. So when students use them, they're not thinking, I'm using AI. They're thinking, I'm using a tool that I've been given. And that reality complicates basic blanket rules like don't use AI, but it does give us an opportunity to be a bit more precise. All in all, we know that AI use in the classroom is varied. It's often invisible to instructors, and it's already deeply entwined with normal day-to-day tools and learning behaviors. So then the next question becomes, well, where does AI introduce problems for teachers? And that's what we'll look at next. There's actually a lot of difficult things right now that many of us are experiencing. So please understand that this slide, I'm not intending to, list a bunch of failures, but it's a list of points that pop up when AI enters the classroom without clear structure. As I read through these, I'm going to ask you to not analyze them yet, but just notice which ones feel familiar. Uncertainty, maybe about what's allowed, is the first one. So many teachers describe starting here, not being sure whether students are allowed to use AI for particular things, explaining the rules on like a case-by-case basis, adjusting the expectations because of the work that they got, or maybe they even give different answers at different times because the evolution of AI. And so when different teachers give different answers, often for good reason, it creates confusion for students and puts the burden then back on you to justify those differences. So we're missing shared language. We also have extra time spent on second guessing the work, which is another common friction point. We focus on whether or not a student wrote it themselves, or we're worrying about their AI use, or spending energy questioning instead of responding to what we have in front of us. And that shift, it changes the sort of emotion around grading, and it takes time away from feedback that really helps with learning. Another one is difficulty judging understanding, just point blank period. I have no idea which part of an assignment reflects the student reasoning, which might be generated or assisted. And so I have to ask myself, does the student understand this? Or is the text just sounding confident? And then I also have issues around, and I've noticed people talk about inconsistent student behavior. So AI also introduces this sort of uneven behavior where some students use AI openly, but others hide it. Some ask for permission, others ask after they've submitted their assignment. And ultimately, it just feels like fairness becomes harder. I have another point here, which is that I need to know if I'm still measuring what I intended or what I'm grading. So we don't want to lower our standards, of course. And so we need to straighten out the misalignment that we experience between whatever task we've given the student and the goal. Then we have language and equity concerns. So AI can help with clarity, especially with students that are working with a second language. But then what about students who have access and those that don't? And it raises some pretty intensive ethical design questions. And then we have classroom conversations that just straight up feel harder to manage. AI can change classroom conversations, discussions into debates around AI ethical issues. And then every time a question about AI comes up, it can feel very loaded. So these conversations become harder, and again, it changes the emotional tone in the classroom. So before we move on, I want to pause and do something very simple. Can you please raise your hand if you have experienced any one of these situations? Just one. Absolutely. It seems like quite a few of us have experienced this. The number keeps going up. So you can put your hands down. But what I want you to notice is not which ones you raised your hands for or why, but that these are just simply not isolated problems. So to reduce these frictions, we can get teaching to feel aligned again, but let's talk about the small explicit changes that matter more, and they matter more than big redesigns. And I'm going to talk about why. These small adjustments matter because they are the most practical, readily available solution. We can look at what we are doing in the classroom and we can change these things immediately. So first, we can fix the problem at the correct level. AI of course, doesn't eliminate learning objectives. It just makes the sort of surface level polished thing a student presents to you cheap. So when we add a small requirement, like asking a student to explain a decision or comparing two different approaches, revising something that's imperfect, we can move assessment and assignment back to where understanding actually is showing up and close that AI gap. Second, clarity shapes behavior better than control. We know that a lot of AI responses focus on surveillance. People want detection tools and restrictions and enforcement, but research has consistently shown us that clear norms and expectations are going to produce more consistent behavior in our students than monitoring, than policing them. Third, small adjustments reduce teacher workload instead of increasing it. Your time is valuable and you have very little of it. So large overhauls might feel proactive, especially in policy or at the big level, but they increase prep time, they require retraining, they break your existing materials, and because of this, they simply don't scale. So small changes, they do all of the opposites of that, right? I can make small changes that can become a reality immediately and reflect how I actually teach. And then what happens when I have this giant policy and I want to do this giant redesign? What happens in the meantime? AI is changing, AI is evolving. So by the time that overhaul happens, it can't be adopted to a certain extent because it's outdated. And then finally, I think we do these big overhauls for visibility, new tools and policies and sweeping reforms. They look like decisive, but they often are just a fear response. We're afraid of AI, we're afraid of cheating, we're afraid of loss of control. And that's not how we want to make decisions. So small adjustments are not happening because of something dramatic. We're doing them because they work in the classroom on a day-to-day basis. All right, so let's get into writing your AI use policy statement. At its core, an AI use state policy statement is shared language that you can create, and it establishes clarity on what is allowed and restricted in the classroom or in an assessment or in an assignment, and clarity about students are responsible for, regardless if they're using AI. And it also explains why the policy itself is being implemented. Please note that an AI use policy statement is not a disciplinary policy. It is task focused, and it does not moralize the use of AI, and it does not rely on fear or shame or warnings. AI use policy statements are intended to answer these questions before they turn into problems. Because without a shared statement, AI expectations get communicated informally, inconsistently, and often after assignments are submitted, and it's too late. So that's when you end up explaining decisions case by case and negotiating with students. And I don't want to stop asking and answering, was this okay? Is that okay? Because we're already past the point of learning. A clear AI use statement then shifts those conversations about what's allowed upstream. They support also ethical practice. They make transparency between this instructor and the student normal, and they encourage fairness in applying expectations consistently. They also clarify accountability without threatening students. And you'll notice that ethical AI use often emerges naturally when expectations are clear, and you don't need heavy language or enforcement. So what is the purpose of a AI use statement? What we want to do here is ensure that we're clarifying what's allowed and restricted, and making sure the policy explains why it's implemented, what is expected versus restricted, and all of those things come together to explain that to a student. And then, how do we actually implement that? What does that actually look like in practice? The characteristics of a strong AI use statement is talking about concrete things that are task focused. So we're going to be naming specific uses that are allowed, specific things, very specific things that are restricted or banned, stating whether learners are still responsible for things regardless of their use of AI, and explaining what counts as acceptable work and what doesn't. This matters because these vague rules push the decision making then back on you. So if you use statements like use AI responsibly or AI is allowed where appropriate, they may sound reasonable, sure, yeah, but they don't actually guide behavior because that language isn't concrete. I can't do anything with that as a student. So this AI statement is going to replace a lot of the guesswork. The second characteristic is that a strong AI use statement connects rules to the principles. So going back to the Girls Go STEM course, you have transparency, accountability, privacy, security, and fairness. And this means explaining why the rule itself exists. Transparency explains why students need disclosure, for example. Accountability explains your responsibility for your submitted work. And here, again, we want to avoid moralizing or fear-based language, which will help to lower students' defensiveness and increase compliance. The third characteristic of an AI use statement is maybe one of the most powerful, and it's that strong AI use statements clearly distinguish between the learning process and the final work that's submitted. So this is how you protect learning without banning helpful tools. So one example might be AI is allowed for brainstorming, drafting, or clarification, but the final submission must reflect your own understanding, and you are responsible to explain and defend what you submit. We'll get into more examples later too, don't worry. And finally, strong AI use statements are short. They fit on a half a page or less, and they can be explained verbally in under 2 minutes. If a statement is too long, your students will not remember it, and you won't be able to consistently apply it. So it won't actually guide behavior then. Being brief is what matters and makes it clear to students. So when you put all of this together, a strong AI use statement reduces ambiguity, it shifts responsibility appropriately, and it aligns with ethical principles to make your teaching easier. That's the whole point. So in this workbook that I've provided, you can create a version of your own. Again, this is not about perfection, so please focus on creating something you can realistically use, which we will draft, have some points for drafting in this next slide. So what does a strong AI use statement look like on the page and in actual language that you can use? Think of this less as a checklist and more of a general structure. So like a way of organizing expectations so that they're clear and fair and easy to apply. So the first thing to notice is that a strong AI use statement uses plain, directive language. You can use simple stems here, like you may, you're expected to, you may not. And these do different kinds of work. So you may gives permission, and it helps reduce anxiety. I know that I can do this as a student. You are expected to then establishes responsibility, shifts responsibility appropriately. And you may not sets boundaries, and it sets clear boundaries without moralizing. Again. So together, these help kind of remove ambiguity in the classroom. And students then should be able to immediately point to the statement and say, this is what applies to me and this assignment in front of me. So together, we want to make sure that this is something that everybody, including you, can use and that students can benefit from. So the second layer here explains why the rules exist. So what is the policy? But the policy exists to what? Accomplish what? The rules help ensure what? Learning requires what? When students understand that the rules are tied to these principles, they're more likely to see them as part of their learning and not your arbitrary restrictions that you've chosen to make life easier for you. And the third section is where the real pedagogy power sits, because strong statements like this explicitly separate the learning from the learning and drafting from that final submitted work again. So it's here that you see while learning and drafting, you should this. But the final work you submit should or must this. Any claims and conclusions should what? So this distinction does two things at once. It protects learning by allowing students during the process of creating their work to develop, to do these things within the boundaries. And it also protects assessment because it's going to make their final work, the expectations, clear to you and clear to the student. So we can measure what comes out of it and they have a clear idea of what's happening during the process. And then finally, you'll notice the constraints here at the bottom. So again, remember, fits on a page or half a page or less and can be explained verbally quickly. So next to this flow chart here, you will see an example. And this is an example of an AI use policy statement that follows this structure, and we'll walk through it. So I want you to listen for where permissions are named, where responsibilities are made explicit, where process and final work are separated, distinguished, and how the tone stays calm and non-punitive. So you don't need to like every word in this statement. I don't expect that, but do listen for the structure and look at as we look at the example together, I'll pause and call out what each part of the statement is doing, not just what it says. So let's start with the opening sentence after I take a drink of water. So over here under example, you'll see it starts with, you may use AI tools to support your learning process, such as brainstorming ideas, asking questions, practicing explanations, and organizing your work. And this does a few important things immediately. First, it uses you may, which gives explicit permission. It helps also reduce anxiety in students. So second, it names specific use cases, brainstorming, asking questions, practicing explanations, organizing work. These are the process level activities. They support thinking, but they aren't the thinking themselves. And then it doesn't give you vague permissions, like use AI responsibly. It's concrete enough that students can recognize their own behavior, so things that they're actually doing. The next sentence says, if you use AI, include a short AI use note at the end of your work that explains what you use AI for and what you did yourself afterward. So this helps build in transparency. It doesn't demand that students send screenshots. It doesn't require you to have a technical knowledge base, and it doesn't threaten students, but it does simply ask students to account for their own processes, which normalizes disclosure, normalizes the process of talking about where I'm using it, and it shifts responsibility to the student and learner without you having to surveil them. And then we can move on down here to the paragraph that begins with however. However, AI is not a scientist. This is where the statement connects rules to learning principles. Okay, so it's explaining that AI can make mistakes, it can produce misleading information, and therefore responsibility is not transferred to the tool. It is still on the student. And that happens in this sentence here where it says, because of this, you are always responsible for what you submit, even if AI helped you. So that single sentence makes expectations clear. We see that if there's ethical questions about what's happening, if there are factual errors, if the resources and whatever you submit is still your responsibility, even if the AI was a part of that process. And then we see later on in the paragraph, it says, in science, learning means asking good questions, using evidence, and explaining why things happen. So this reminds students what counts as learning. And it leads directly into the next sentence, which says AI can support learning, but cannot replace careful thinking and scientific evidence. So this distinguishes using it as a support instead of a substitution for science, right? Which is a distinction that is really at the heart of what we're talking about today. And then we move into restrictions. It finally says at the end, you may not copy AI-generated answers and submit them as your own thinking. It's direct, it is specific, and it's very clear about what is not allowed. And then it says you must also check facts using class materials, textbooks, or trusted sources. So the accountability then again is specific. And then at the end here, it says any data, conclusions, explanations you turn in must be ones that you understand and can explain. And this sentence is probably the most crucial because it tells students that they'll be evaluated on their understanding and what they can explain, but not whether AI was used. So then AI without disclosure counts as cheating. You can use AI to help you understand, to help you draft, but you're responsible for what you submit. And if you don't tell me how you used AI, you're cheating. This works because everything before this in sentence was clear. So when we get down to the fact what is cheating, all of it kind of builds up to why it would make sense that not disclosing your AI use would be cheating. So overall, this example gives permission, it sets responsibility, it explains why the rules exist, it distinguishes what's appropriate in the process versus what's appropriate in the final work, and it's short enough to be remembered. I think that there are still some ways that this policy could be improved and more specific, but it's a good starting place. And any more than this, it's out of context, right? So what's going to happen in your classroom and how you're going to look at it and what you need to call out is going to be specific to what you're teaching, how you're teaching, and what your process looks like. But if that's a decent or good example, what is a poor statement? So let's look deliberately right now at an example of a poor statement. It's very close to language that's still widely used and often with good intentions, though. You know, people are not putting these statements in because they are wanting to hurt their environments. And it's something that did used to work. But I am not going to explain what's wrong with this yet. That comes next. So what I want you to do is I want you to read it as if you were a student who is encountering this statement. So here I'll read it. It's the use of AI tools is discouraged and may be considered cheating. Students are expected to complete all work independently. Any suspected use of AI will be investigated and may result in disciplinary action. Okay. So now in the chat, I want you to answer a question. Why does this count, do you think, as a poor AI use statement? You can write in the chat what feels off, what feels unclear, what's unhelpful. There's no like single right answer, just what you see. And if you're struggling to articulate why it's poor, that's okay. We often notice first things like if this would make me defensive or if it would confuse a student, or maybe you think that this would create more problems than it would solve. So I'll give you about 1 minute to add your thoughts to the chat, read others' responses, and in the next slide, we'll look at why these kinds of statements consistently fail and what they do to teaching and learning. Hello. So I'll just give you about a minute here and take a short break. So the first response we have is that the student will lose the opportunity of using AI capabilities to improve their work, even if it's not cheating, which is true. It's a pity to limit the students in not using AI. They should learn to use AI for enriching their look on items, their outlook on items. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you for participating. I really do appreciate it. Let's move on and let's talk about why or how this could be improved or what's wrong with it, if you will. It's confusing for students. AI is inevitable today. Yes, absolutely. So specifically in relationship to the things that we had pointed out about strong characteristics of an AI statement, there are some things that stand out there. But we have another response that says disciplinary action should not be used for use of AI. Teachers may say that the works will not be accepted if the AI uses them. Okay, all right. So the first issue in the statement is that it never actually defines what counts as AI use. So students are left guessing. Like as you said, AI is everywhere, right? But this statement assumes that a learning environment that assumes that there is a learning environment that just simply doesn't exist anymore. So students don't experience AI as a single or separate tool. Like we talked about, there's spell check, there's grammar checks. Is it generating questions? What about the tools that are built into the software, right? So when those definitions are missing, we can anticipate that conflict is going to happen. Second, this language unintentionally encourages students to hide their AI use. So when AI is framed as primarily something that might be considered cheating, students are unsure and then they tend to just stay quiet, and honest disclosure is not encouraged. And transparency could ultimately be punished rather than rewarded. So this is the opposite of what we want in a learning environment if responsibility is visible. And third, the statement places the burden of detection and enforcement on you. Phrases like suspected AI use will be investigated. That makes you into a police officer rather than an educator. So instead of designing tasks where understanding is visible and we can see the learning process, the system relies on suspicion and interference and after the fact judgment, which is time intensive, it's emotionally draining, and it's very rarely palatable. So now we're going to move on from this poor example to an improved statement. So let's look at another example. And this one's not, oh no, didn't update. Oh, I put another example here, but I guess it didn't save. Okay, here we go. So another example, this one's better, it's not terrible, but it's not especially helpful. So this is why we're going to call it average. A lot of AI use statements kind of fall into this category. They're well-intentioned and they try to set boundaries, but they really just don't do quite enough to support learning or reduce problems. So take a moment to kind of feel how this one feels different from the poor example, but also what hasn't changed in this example. And so again, in the chat, if you'd like to offer one reason in addition to the ones that I have provided as to why this is only an average statement, please do so. And if it helps, you might think about questions like, what does this clarify compared to the poor example? And what questions would students still have? And where would this still create uncertainty or extra work for you? So again, I'll read the statement just for those that would like to hear this from an audio perspective. It is, students may use AI tools in limited ways to support their learning. Oh, sorry. Students may use AI tools in limited ways to support their learning, such as for brainstorming or checking grammar. However, AI should not be used to generate final answers or complete assignments. Students are expected to submit their own original work and remain responsible for what they turn in. If AI tools are used, students should ensure that their work reflects their own understanding. Improper use of AI may be considered academic misconduct and handled according to course policies. Again, I'll take a 1-minute break here and give you a moment to share your thoughts. And I will also go back and read the thoughts about the poor statement. So a couple of you have contributed more information about the poor statement. And then once the person said it's bad because we say to them the AI is forbidden, it's too restrictive and students could feel bad and we want to collaborate with them. That's great. That's true. And another response about the core statement said it doesn't support using AI, which is there. Students would learn new things and see new aspects if they used AI. The teacher can't be sure if students used AI, so the teacher could act unfair. Very true. And then finally, the last response here on the previous core statement was banning AI does not stop students from using it. It only drives use underground and encourages dishonesty. When bans are imposed without clear reasoning, they harm pedagogy, whereas teaching students to use AI ethically is more effective and fosters trust and meaningful learning. Absolutely. Okay. I'll wait for some responses to come in. We can revisit it and let's keep it then. So now we are on to section 3. And section 3 here is going to be talking about adjusting assignments for an AI world. So up to this point, we've been focusing on setting expectations, like using AI use statements to reduce confusion and ambiguity. But now we're going to move on to the next layer, which is assignment design and where the learning actually happens. So as you know, assignments are different from assessments. And because of that, assignments are also where AI shows up most naturally and where we see it happening the most. So our goal is to make sure that the assignment still requires thinking, understanding, and supports learning when it's available. So in most cases, 1 or 2 small shifts is going to be enough to restore alignment. And what the assignment asks for and what you want the student to learn. So what this section focuses on is let's look at AI related adjustments when they are necessary. So when are they necessary? The key idea at the top here says AI related adjustments are necessary when an assignment can no longer reliably demonstrate student understanding because of available AI tools. That's the test that we'll use throughout this entire section. If an assignment still shows understanding clearly, we don't need to change it at all. So let's start with the first category. We have assignments that often mainly measure recall or a surface explanation. And these are the most vulnerable category. So examples like define photosynthesis and explain how it works. AI can do that in a moment's notice and it can do it 17,000 different ways. Other examples can be like definition worksheets, short answer concepts, basic research summaries. These are things where you're going to see AI showing up a lot. And these tasks do used to be able to tell us something about understanding or at least recall, but now AI can generate such accurate, fluent explanations that it doesn't really mean that the student can do it themselves. And this doesn't mean that content is unimportant. I don't want you to hear me say that, but the task is no longer distinguishes between knowing the answer and knowing how to generate the answer. And that's where this is misaligned. So then we see the second category here is when tasks reward being polished or fine-tuned more than the reasoning in that task. So how many times I saw write a well-structured essay to explain X, Y, or Z topic in my education was a lot, right? And those were usually graded very heavily on writing quality, and also there were like lab reports with very rigid formatting requirements. And it's important that students understand these things, but AI is very good at producing this sort of smooth structure. So if we're seeing an assignment where the polish is taking more weight, making sure that all the organizational steps are met, then we need to step back and think about how we can make this adjustment for AI. Then we have when outputs are going to be very predictable and when we know that the patterns are there. So if many students are going to be submitting to you a near identical answer to meet certain criteria, the assignment isn't going to reliably measure individual thinking anymore. And the last, if it ever did, honestly. And the last category are assignments that don't make understanding visible, even without AI. So if we have fill in the blank questions, math questions where we're just giving the correct calculations, maybe you have presentation slides, but there's no explanation on those. These tasks are about what the result is and not about how the student got there. So AI just makes the invisibility of the learning more obvious in these contexts. And in these cases, the fix is usually about adding explanation, annotation, or reflection, not changing the core task. So I want to emphasize something here. None of these categories mean that the assignments are bad, but they mean the assignment is no longer doing the job that you originally designed it to do. So now that we've identified when the adjustments are necessary, we need to look at what practical small changes we can make. So what actually helps you adjust assignments? Before we start going through these options, let me also acknowledge that yes, AI can generate process narratives. It can generate reflections and justifications and revisions. In fact, no rubric, prompt, or design can AI proof understanding. Just like we couldn't cheat proof understanding in the past. So if a student decides to fully delegate their thinking, rehearses something and uses someone else's reasoning and never has to act on this in real time, then yes, AI or any form of cheating could potentially carry them. But again, the purpose is not to AI proof understanding, but rather the purpose is to shift the assignment back to incorporating AI in a way that supports learning rather than avoiding it. So in this first category, we have to emphasize process. This means that students don't just submit their final product, but they show how they worked, what steps it took to get there, how their thinking evolved, and especially how AI was used. And this supports problem solving, metacognition, which is thinking about one's own thinking, the transfer of knowledge. So when students explain their process, you no longer have to grade just the result that you got, but you're grading how they thought. Rubrics could focus on things like how well they documented the process, what steps they've taken and if they were appropriate, the quality of the revisions that they made, and the reasoning behind those changes. So the process should show intentional decision making. The second adjustment is asking students, the second category here, why they made certain changes. For example, why did you choose this method? Why are you interpreting it this way? Or why this solution over alternative solution? This develops reasoning and justification, decision-making, and it makes evidence-based argumentation necessary. So your rubrics could focus on things like clearly explaining what specific methods, approaches, or ideas were chosen over others. And you can evaluate how well the student connects decisions to concepts, evidence, or constraints. In this third category here, we are going to take the usual fear of AI and we are going to flip it on its head. Instead of asking, did the student use AI? You're going to ask and start with AI. Students submit an AI-generated output first, and then improve it, correct it, refine it, or explain what's wrong with it. This directly targets things like critical thinking, error detection, quality judgment, and AI eventually becomes the object of analysis instead of the author of the work. And you might naturally ask, can AI evaluate its own work? Sure, it absolutely can. But have you ever asked an overly competent student to find their errors in an assignment? It works just as poorly. The fourth adjustment is to make an AI a declared tool. What does that mean? It means that students are explicitly expected to use AI where appropriate and disclose how they use it. This supports ethical tool use, transparency, accountability, and digital literacy. So when AI is declared, you remove the secrecy. Rubrics can focus on demonstrated understanding of accurate explanations, process, connection with prior knowledge, and the thought and application of the digital tools themselves. So we can also see if students can clearly explain their thought process, and we can ask them orally if we need to about the certain concepts behind them. We also can, as a final adjustment, focus on progress in the student that submit drafts, revisions, and reflections on what they changed and why. But we're really focusing on how they change from feedback, their own self-assessments, how they evaluate their own persistence, and really a self-reflective type of approach where AI can help them with drafts. AI can't help them self-reflect. And rubrics can focus on the student, what they learned, what was challenging, what changed during their process. But students would be expected to identify specific improvements and learning points in their own minds and process. And I want to note something that I've learned about this particular last suggestion, but it does apply to the other suggestions as well, as it's something that surprised me. When students are genuinely engaged in their own learning and in their own self-development, they do tend to be much harder on themselves than we would expect. So when we ask a student to explain their process and reflect on their decisions and describe what changed in their thinking, many will not try to inflate their performance. They will notice the gaps, the uncertainties, and the weaknesses that weren't visible in the final product, even if you were to evaluate just that, right, to you. And we know from research on self-assessment and metacognition that learners are asked, when learners are asked to evaluate their own understanding, they underestimate their performance pretty consistently rather than exaggerate it, especially when they're doing something complex or unfamiliar. So, in other words, these are process-focused prompts that don't just help teachers see the learning, but they help students see their own learning more clearly anyways. So this doesn't mean that every student will engage perfectly, of course, but when assignments are designed with this in mind, many students will shift from asking you, did I do enough to get the grade? Is it good enough? To asking, I don't know if I really understand this yet. Do I understand this yet? And that change from the ultimate performance into focusing on the learnings, this is where the approach that we're taking really does work, regardless of even AI use. So finally, I want to stress that you're not choosing all of these, okay? This is where you can really focus in on one assignment and try to make it more concrete in the way that you're using it. So I want you to sit and reflect for a second. What is one way that you could think of easily implementing one of these adjustments in a class that you already teach? It can be something small, a rough idea. It doesn't have to be perfect. But as you reflect, you'll likely see that many of these ideas already are happening, and partly in practice. And there's small tweaks that you can make as you go along the way, and that's the point. So in the chat, you can drop some ideas if you have them, but I would also like you to just raise your hand if you could see maybe one way that this could be incorporated. And if not, don't worry, we'll get into a little bit more specific detail in a moment. Good. I'm so glad. I'm glad we've got a few hands raised. But if you still don't see it, don't worry. There's some more information about how to do this in the next slide. So what are some ways that we can implement this? I wanted this slide to be as practical as possible. So you'll notice that there's a consistent pattern across all four of these situations, which is that when an assignment becomes vulnerable to being too focused on the output or to AI, and you can no longer reliably use it in your learning, you don't have to replace the whole thing. You can just add one step. So kind of think of this as like a one-step fix toolkit. And when the assignment primarily measures recall or like a surface level explanation, you can see here at the top that the one-step fix that I would suggest is to add a task that shifts us away from reproduction to evaluation or evidence sharing. So if the task is repeat a known explanation, AI, like we said, will do that easily. So instead of a definitional worksheet where you just have the word and you fill in the definition, you can ask students to use AI to generate an alternative definition. And then the learning task becomes which definition is better, which one's clearer, which one's more accurate, and what evidence from the text in the class support that judgment. So they aren't graded on having a definition that they know, but they're evaluated on their reasoning, and it also gives them more opportunity to engage with that material and understand the definition. If we're talking about a research summary, for example, you can have AI produce 3 different basic summaries on the same topic, and then ask the students which is more helpful for your understanding, which is the least helpful, what's missing from one explanation to another, and what would you change to make it more useful or accurate? And again, this shifts it from just produce some content for me, and I'll evaluate that content, to look at the content, judge it for its usefulness. And we're getting deeper into the learning process and judging that learning process. As we move forward here, we're talking about making things more visible and ensuring that we have a way to show quality improvement over time. So instead of having a prompt where we are going to look at a finished essay and say, yes, it has an introduction, yes, it has a conclusion, it has a topic sentence, it has a concluding sentence, I want you to write me a rough draft. I want you to improve that rough draft. I want you to have notes on how you improve that rough draft, and I'm going to look at how you evolve over time. Because I want to know what you're changing and why, instead of just knowing that you can produce that final output. If you have, for example, a lab report with rigid formatting requirements, add some reflective prompts. What made you decide to do this? How did you understand the structure? What would you do to improve the structure of this report? And that sort of thing. Again, getting the student to engage a bit deeper. And when we have an assignment that is predictable and generic, we can introduce one novel choice. So if we have something that, is, I can go in and I can just generate it from ChatGPT, ask the student to do so by applying that concept to your individual school, to their individual house or their individual family, something hyper local, something that AI is not going to have a lot of information about, and something that maybe will emotionally engage the student so that they will want to do something besides just have that general output. If you have a template-based writing project, you can have AI produce a template, and you can have a human produce a template, and then have students guess which one was written by a human, which one was written by AI, why they think so, the pros and the cons of each, and I really evaluate it from that perspective instead of just trying to fill in the template alone and by themselves. And then maybe they take that evaluation to create their own version that could be AI and human created together for the best version that they can create. And then finally, anytime we have something where we have a final product and we just simply can't know if the student has done it, like a correct calculation, we are going to take a note from all of the math teachers out there, and we are going to have you show your work. I want to know how you got there. If I have presentation slides that I want you to give me, I'm not going to ask you for screenshots. I'm not going to ask you to record your process, but instead I might have a short oral session, or I might ask you 1 or 2 questions where you can prove your knowledge to me. So then we have to get into maybe adjusting the methodology sometimes, but for the most part, this can be done through the assignment change without a major shift in how we're presenting this information. Okay. Let me pause here for a moment, take a drink. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I know we are getting to the end of our time, so I will make sure that we leave a little bit of time here, that I'll stay around after this for a little bit of time to answer your questions, but I want to make it through what we can do to adjust assessments. All right. So when do we need to make an adjustment to an assessment? Many assessments that we're using will still work, even with the introduction of AI. Because of the way that we are delivering that assessment, because of the constraints that students are put under, and there's no access to AI during those assessments. But there are many environments where students will still have access to AI when they are completing an assessment. And in those cases, we need to think about what small adjustments we can make. And there are some ways to do this that will not have the evaluation suffer. So the core challenge here is designing assessment tasks where AI does not replace, making sure that the learning goals were achieved. So we're going to look at what's actually necessary, and we'll start by identifying where AI actually threatens the validity of an assessment and when it doesn't. So we've talked about why, 1 second, very sorry. So I want you to look at here what the evidence of thinking actually produces. I want you to know whether or not AI can complete the task without knowing the students of your class. If AI can do it and you are sending this off for students to complete without knowing you, we need to make it a little bit more contextualized for your learning environment. I want you to think about the hardest step in your assessment. What is the hardest piece of the assessment, whether it's a case study or whether it's a written exam? And I want you to ask if AI could do it for the student. Because if AI could do it for the student, we want to pause for a second and we want to think about how we can then instill annotations, reflection, or one of the things that we've talked about with assignments, where it will make it more personalized and ensure that we can understand a depth of learning that may not be evident in just that output. I also want to ask a question here at the end, which is, does the future task that we are grading in this assignment, what is it preparing students for? And does AI exist in that future? Because if AI does exist in that future, and you're seeing that this assessment item is having difficulty measuring it, then perhaps we adjust that assessment or that assessment item for the reality and the present that we're living in, and ensure that it's measuring what can be measured, regardless of AI presence in that field. So what do I mean? Let's get a little bit more concrete here. So I would change the way that you deliver an assessment to an oral exam, even if it is a bit more time consuming in some cases, when the learning outcomes are kind of lower on Bloom's taxonomy. So we want things that require understanding or reasoning, maybe some synthesis. You want to have them explain those things to you orally when possible. No, oral presentations can be done in an online environment as well. You can give students a limited amount of time. There are softwares that are available, or you can simply do it in a webcam situation. Now, if you do it in a webcam situation, you might need some softwares to ensure that they're not having anything else up on their computer, or you might need a proctor. So I know that it can get complicated, which is why the majority of AI pedagogy is focused on taking it from simple regurgitation, simple definitional reasoning up a step or up a level in Bloom so that we can make sure there's depth of learning, but also that it can't be replicated by AI. But in situations where that is the learning outcome and it has to be the learning outcome, and there are plenty of situations where that's the case, maybe an oral exam is something to think about. If we cannot do an oral exam and simply out of the question, this can also apply to annotated submissions. So when we are looking at annotated submissions, when we are talking about decision-making, interpretation, evaluation, method selection, we want to ask students, why did you choose this source? Why do you choose this answer? Why did you structure it this way? So not only do they have an output, but they are telling you why that output is correct in their view. And then you are not necessarily grading the output, you are grading the annotations. So you want to grade their reasoning and their justifications instead of looking at just that final thing that you were looking at for the original grade. And then finally, instill a reflection or a process tool when we are looking at intended learning outcomes that involve metacognition, thinking about thinking, strategic thinking, and skills development over time. So these reflections can include things like what I initially did, what I changed, where I struggled. And none of these things are unique to assessment except for the delivery method, right? The oral examination. So what you'll see is as you adjust assignments to be more about the learning process and less about the outcome, the assessment will also start to mirror that and make sense and align them that way. We don't want to be building as an assignment that talks about a process and then looking at an output in an assessment, right? Those are misaligned again. So these things will kind of connect to each other as we build them. And we are going to think about those things as we're redoing the assignments one at a time in a small and manageable way. The last thing to consider here, again, is this idea of using a novel or contextualized scenario. So if you're teaching a student a skill that they need to be able to replicate, we want to offer an assessment environment where it's, again, either hyper-local, maybe time-specific, or you're offering them a novel data set. And this is especially appropriate in a traditional learning environment where time is limited, but you can do this online as well. In timed environments, giving them something new, something hyper-local that AI can't deal with as well, and ensuring that the analysis can be applied appropriately to something that is more difficult to replicate in an online environment. And again, I copied and pasted the sort of ideas here from the assignments because I think that they are also applicable to assessments. We want to emphasize process even in assessment. We want to emphasize explanation of choices and reasoning even in assessment. And we can also incorporate AI in assessment. So I remember the very first time I ever had an instructor with an open book exam. And I thought to myself, open note, open book exam, what are you trying to accomplish here? You just want me to memorize things? And then I got to the exam and I realized that it was so much less about understanding the information that was in the textbook. And it was way more about looking at a scenario and making judgment calls and explaining the process that I would take. And I could use my notes and I could use my book, but I needed to think on my own. And in doing so, the same things and the same questions we can ask ourselves. Imagine a world where we have an open AI exam. Can you imagine structuring an exam for a world where a lot of this information is at their fingertips? I do think the same principles to an open book or open note exam can apply. Why? Because we can take something like a detailed scenario and we can have students explain what the problem is, identify the problem, then ask the student to walk you through what one option solution would be and why it's better than another option solution, what's going to happen if you change one variable. Or you could even ask them about the prompts that they submit. So identify the problem, present me with a solution, and show me how you got to that solution using various prompts. Explain to me why you phrased the prompt this way. Explain to me why you left certain things out. If you had to go back and do it again to find another answer, what would you change about those prompts and why? And then we again are seeing evidence of learning self-reflection. I think that is an exciting thing to think about. I think that it is, something that we can take an assessment that we maybe already have in front of us. Maybe we already have an open book exam, maybe not, and think about how it could be done in an environment where students literally have the world at their fingertips. And I will end today's session by just reminding us that I know we've talked a lot about how to ensure that students are still learning in an AI environment, but AI also can help improve assignment and assessment outcomes. We know from lots of research that's coming out recently that the students have really positive experiences, especially in assessment outcomes when they use AI wisely. through things like personalizing their learning, using AI to maybe adjust something to an audio learning environment, in a reading when they maybe struggle to read, boosting their performance on exams, assessments and exams through that way. We know that AI tutors, especially when they're well designed, can really improve student outcomes in the same way that traditional tutors do. And students can get immediate, detailed feedback from AI, which helps them to have a really fast feedback cycle. So we can see improvements happening in a much more rapid way than traditional learning because of that. And that's exciting as well. And then finally, we know that if we want better assessment outcomes, we can use AI to engage our students and to continue to embrace the changes that are happening as much as possible to create an interactive learning environment, and then we still see improved assessment outcomes. So please, if you haven't already, return to the Zoom lobby, download the workbook. You can use it to finalize your AI policy. You can use it to identify one way that you might change an assignment or an assessment. And I encourage you to please share one idea that you've learned with a colleague or teaching team so that we can start having very productive conversations around how we can use AI in the classroom that are not about big policy changes, but they are about, teachers in a peer-to-peer learning environment. If you have any questions, please, I'll stick around, drop them in the chat. But if not, I really appreciate your time today. And I want you to continue to, learn about how these things will affect us in the future, but how we can use them to improve student retention. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll do my best to respond and stay around a little bit longer. But thank you for taking this seriously, and I appreciate you.